Sadly, the church is in decline today.
If truth does not exist, we will not be able to live and function as civilized individuals in a society.
Students in the public education system at large of our nation are left with the impression God's irrelevant because he's never mentioned.
We sort of have national Alzheimer's. Here we are, the freest country that the world has ever seen, with more individual freedom and opportunity to choose what you want to do with your life and where you want to go to church. We have that, and we forgot how we got here.
So we're going to answer the question, why all the fuss?
Despite ever-increasing efforts to undermine the authority and accuracy of God's Word, the Bible stands firm.
Science and the Bible are inextricably linked.
We see evidence of incredible design.
God has made it incredibly clear.
Men, listen to me today. God has a calling on your life. Kids need you. Women need you. Our country needs fathers and responsible husbands today.
55 out of 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Bible-believing, church-attending Christians.
We have the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world.
The Western world was successful because it was built upon biblical values.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be with you. I want you guys to imagine that you have never read the Bible before in your life, never been exposed to any Bible story, you know nothing about it, and you're in school, you're in a high school history class, and you come to world history, and you find this guy named Moses. And Moses is a guy who had been an Egyptian, and he led a revolt against Pharaoh, and he took all the Jews out of Egypt, took them over and got them established, and that's how Israel became a nation. And that's what you get. Or you can imagine something like you take Jesus. Jesus was a great reformer, and you know nothing, you've never read the Bible. Jesus was a great reformer. He was able to stand up against the Roman Empire and introduce a whole new paradigm of thinking of the world. You know nothing else. And then you find a Bible and you open it and you start reading about Moses. And you start reading all these miracles that happened and all the stuff that happened out in the desert. And you start reading about just divine intervention by God. And you go, man, this is awesome. Or you do that with Jesus and find out Jesus actually was not a prophet. He was the Son of God and performed all these miracles. You didn't know that. That's the way American history has been in our schools for about 60 years. You read great people and you get very little of what actually happened in their life. You get an overview and it stays secular. We don't say anything about spiritual stuff. So what I'm gonna do in this session, I'm gonna take you through some people you already know. You're gonna know the names of everyone I talk about. You're probably not going to know the stories that I share with you about these folks. And these are stories we used to share in previous generations, and boy, did they make a difference when you see those stories. So in looking at this, we're looking at history. We're going to look at miracles in history, same as they would be miracles in the life of Jesus or miracles in the life of Paul or miracles in the life of Moses or whoever. And we're going to call it providential history. And I use that term because that is a term that was very popular in all generations except today. If you talk about providential history now, or you talk about the founding fathers believing in providence, people say, well, that's a deistic term for God. No, it's not. The Geneva Bible that we talked about earlier this morning, the Geneva Bible the Pilgrims used, the Geneva Bible, now let me, the King James Bible mentions the word providence one time. The Geneva Bible mentions the word providence 144 times. Providence is a big doctrine in the Bible unless you happen to grow up in this culture where, providence. George Washington talked about providence. That means he's an atheist, agnostic deist because real people talk about God or Jesus or whatever. No, that's a biblical term. He was using biblical terms that they were familiar with. So I want to show you a couple of historians. This man is called, his name is George Bancroft. He's the father of American history. And this is what he's the guy that really systematized American history. Starting in 1844, he came out with a 10-volume set of history books. He went from 1844 to 1884. Took him that long to put it, but he's the first guy to tell American history all the way from Columbus to where they were in 1880s and do it systematically, person by person, year by year. So he's called the father of American history, and this is what he said. He said, the fortunes of a nation are not under the control of blind destiny, but they follow the steps by which a favoring providence, calling our institutions into being, has conducted the country to its present happiness and glory. You'll see a lot of coincidences in history. Don't see them as coincidences. Look and see if God's doing something special there. Look and see if that's a divine intervention, something miraculous that God does to change the course of history. He continued that God rules in the affairs of men is as certain as any truth of physical science. Nothing is by chance, though men in their ignorance of causes may think so. God getting involved in history is just as sure as the laws of gravity, and God works toward his end, what he wants to see in a nation. This man is named Charles Coffin. He was the most popular journalist in the Civil War. After the Civil War, he wrote history books, a great 5-volume set still available today. It's been reprinted by Charles Coffin. But he in the introduction to his books, to give you the overview of what he's going to show you, this is what he said. He said, notice that while oppressors have carried out their plans in history, there were other forces silently at work, which in time undermined their plans, as if a divine hand were directing the counterplan. He says, whoever produces a story of liberty without recognizing this feature will fail of fully comprehending the meaning of history. He said, there must be a meaning to history, or else existence is an incomprehensible enigma. And that's why history has been such a boring subject for so many years, particularly over the last 6 decades, because there's no divine hand in it. There's no purpose to it. It's a bunch of coincidences, a bunch of facts and dates and names and places. There's no stories anymore. And so the way we used to teach American history was we did not exclude God from history, which made it just as fun as reading the history of the Bible. It's fun to read the history of the Bible, even if you're not a Christian, just to see all the things that happen, all the stories that are there. And so Charles Coffin, he talked about these other forces that are silently at work, and he talked about a divine hand directing the counterplan. That's called providential history. This is where God steps in and changes the direction things are headed because he has certain ends he wants to achieve. Historians sometimes can't explain that, particularly if they're secular historians since the 1960s. So I'm going to take you through some stories. There's so many I could give. 18th century is the 1700s. If I just took George Washington alone, go back to the first battle he was ever engaged in 1755, the Battle of Monongahela in the French and Indian War, when he's a 23-year-old colonel. He writes about the dramatic miracle that happened to him in that battle. I'm not going to go through it, but it's just, I have a book called The Bulletproof George Washington. It talks about that miracle. But if you just followed Washington, of all the people in the 1700s, if you just followed Washington, you took him all the way through the American War for Independence, do you know that George Washington himself in his own writings, now there's nearly 100 volumes of Washington's writings to and from him, the volumes are out there. Washington himself documents more than 250 times that he saw God step in and change the direction of something. So 250 accounts of providential intervention. That's a lot of God getting involved in stuff. God was involved. God was interested in what was going on. That's why he got involved. So I'm going to jump into the 19th century, the 1800s. I'm going to take one person there, and then I'm going to show you more in the 20th century, some of the history that we should have gotten but we didn't get, and it makes it much more interesting when you see what it was. But if you take the 1800s, I want to start with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, when he's a young boy, born in 1809, he grew up in a family, and it was unfortunate that his father was very abusive. Was very abusive to the family and to Abraham and the children and everybody else. And so as a result, Lincoln says, man, go to church every Sunday and get beat up during the week. He said, I don't think I like Christianity. So Lincoln determined not to become a Christian. He moved toward atheism. He was known as the village atheist. He moved toward what they called free thinking back then. And so he gets away from the farm when he can. He goes on and he becomes an attorney. He's still the village atheist. As a matter of fact, one of the things that helped him become an atheist was he read a debate between three deists. Well, he read a debate between some deists and a preacher, and he thought the deists had the much better argument. They just were more cogent in their thinking, had better points. And so he read stuff that helped him say, you know, Christianity is pretty shallow, and I've seen how it acts at home, and I don't like Christianity. And so what happens as he moves on in that direction, he ends up memorizing the Bible so that he can debate with all the preachers who think they know about the Bible. And he knew the Bible better than preachers did. and he could win the debates with the preachers, and that kind of proved his point, is preachers don't really know much about this, because he knew more than they did, and he didn't believe in God. So what happens, he becomes a law partner with a guy named William Herndon. Lincoln and Herndon's the law firm. They're both free thinkers. They're both atheists. Herndon was not a Christian either, but Lincoln continues on, and he becomes a judge. He gets involved in the legislature, and as he's still moving in this free-thinking direction, still the village atheist, he came across a book that was done by Reverend James Smith. Now, Reverend James Smith was a Presbyterian pastor in Springfield, and in 1841, Reverend James Smith was in a debate with a noted freethinker, a noted deist. The guy was named C.G. Olmsted. And 2 years later, that work was published in 1843, and it was called A Christian's Defense. And it came out, the work actually came out from Pastor Smith, who after the debate said, there's probably a lot of people who don't understand this, so let me do a book on it. So he did a book showing both sides, showing the deist side, showing his answers, and Lincoln read that book, and as an attorney and as a judge, he said, that's really good. That's the best explanation I've seen of this. He had really good answers. First time I've seen a Christian be able to stand up to a deist and somebody else, a freethinker. And so what happened, and you can see the title of the book, it's an impartial, fair statement, impartial examination of the leading objections raised by infidels, which that's what Lincoln was. But it's 1 Peter 3:15, be able to give a reason for the hope that's within you. Most Christians can give an answer for the hope that's within them. They can't give a reason. They can't explain. They can't debate. They can't stand up and defend their things. They know what they believe. They don't know why they believe what they believe. And in this book, Pastor Smith showed that he knew why he believed what he believed and what it was grounded on. And so what happened was Lincoln ends up later, as a result of a crisis, contacting James Smith. He has respect for him now because he's read his work. This guy thinks really well, uses his brain, and the crisis with Lincoln happened in 1850. At that point in time, his son Eddie died. Now, Lincoln had 4 boys, 3 of them ended up dying young, only 1 survived to adulthood. Mary Todd Lincoln, there were 5 men in her life, 4 boys and Abraham, and 4 of the 5 died. It was a tough life for Mary Todd, which maybe explains why she seemed to be kind of at times off balance, because she's lost all these men out of her life, her kids. And so when Eddie died, it was tragedy. It was just hard on Mary Todd. It was hard on Abraham. And so Abraham reached out to James Smith, didn't know him at that time, but he read his book and said, hey, would you be willing to do the funeral of our son that just died? And Smith said, sure, I'll do that. And so that developed a relationship that actually, by 1853, this is a letter that we have from 1853. It's a 4-page letter, actually 3 pages and signature page. I mentioned earlier that we have 2 large museums in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. If you get there, there's one in North Dallas. There's one over in West Fort Worth. We have about 160,000 items, original items from American history, including this letter from James Smith. And James Smith said, 1853, Lincoln, he heard a knock on his door. He went to the door, and it was Abraham Lincoln. He didn't know Lincoln. But Lincoln said, hey, I've studied your stuff. I've seen what you've done. You make sense. I've been an atheist for a long time. I'm a judge. I'm an attorney. I know that you have to examine both sides of every question. I've done that, and there's no question that God exists. But I need help coming to faith. Can you help me come back to faith because I've been an atheist so long? And Smith said, sure, I can help you do that. And so Smith started mentoring Abraham. And over the next 4 years, as he would disciple him and take him through the things and answer his objections and answer his questions, it got to the point where he told Abraham, he explains this in the letter, he told Abraham, and this is 1853, this is when he has this contact with Lincoln, and he told Abraham eventually, a couple years later, he said, Abraham, he said, you've really come a long way, you're starting to get this, you're getting strong, you're getting stable, you need to preach a sermon. And Lincoln was petrified. Said, no way, I will not. And Smith worked with him, said, you need to talk publicly about this. And so what Smith said was, he says, look, here at the church, the County Bible Society comes here and meets at the church every month. And there's only 7 or 8 ladies that are in it. Why don't you do a Bible study for that meeting? And so Lincoln agreed to do that. And so Lincoln agreed to do this Bible study. And he did, according to Pastor Smith, he did a sermon on the 10 Commandments. And Pastor Smith said, that was the best teaching I've ever heard on the 10 Commandments. And so that kind of launched Lincoln back into some confidence and coming back to faith. 1857, that relationship kind of ends because Lincoln runs for the U.S. Senate. He did not get elected, but that's the Lincoln-Douglas debates that occur. And then he ran for president in 1860 and got elected in 1860. So Lincoln's elected president, and at that point in time, for the time between the election until the time you were sworn in as president was 6 months. And so in the Constitution has now been changed where it's only a couple of months. You have an election in November and you're sworn in. Well, the election back then was much earlier and you weren't sworn in until March. So you had 6 months. In that 6 months, the nation went to pieces. When Lincoln was elected, that's when Southern states started saying, not us. We will not be under President Lincoln. And so you had the Declaration of Secession in South Carolina. You had the Declaration of Secession in Mississippi. 11 states seceded. 5 states gave declarations of independence. And when you read the declarations of independence, people say it was all about states' rights. Well, let me just show you the one that you see right there. Mississippi says, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world, and goes on to explain that Lincoln is going to impede our ability to do slavery stuff. So the states that gave their Declaration of Independence said it was all about slavery. People today say, oh no, it's just states' rights. Well, yeah, it was, but the state right they were the most concerned about was the right to own slaves. And so those 11 states seceded and the Union is dissolved. And as a result, before Lincoln is inaugurated president, and the next week, those 11 states announced their Constitution. And the Constitution is almost like the U.S. Constitution. The wording is nearly identical, except they have a bunch of pro-slavery clauses in it. Whereas the U.S. Constitution didn't have that. They said you cannot end slavery, you cannot pass laws for abolition. That's part of the Confederate Constitution. You have to be a slave state. So by the time Lincoln is sworn in, the South has declared war. So first thing he steps into is a war. He doesn't even get to enjoy the inauguration. He is now in a war, and it's a war among Americans. That's why it's a civil war. And so you had Americans fighting Americans, and this was tough on Lincoln, who was coming to faith, who is trying to understand God and seeing this mess in front of him. And this is what he said. He said, this is really difficult. He said, you look at the North, you look at the South. He said, both of them read the same Bible and both pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. The Confederacy was having days of prayer and fasting that God would intervene to smite the North. And the North is having days of prayer and fasting that God would intervene to smite the South. And he continued, he said, the prayers of both cannot be answered, and that of neither will be fully answered. So he's in a lose-lose situation. Any way you go at it, you got two Christian groups fighting each other, and God's not going to answer the prayers of both. He can't answer the prayers of both because they're opposite. So he talked about how that changed his life. He said, I've been driven many times to my knees by the overwhelming conviction I had nowhere else to go. And that's what really kind of started developing his spiritual life as a brand new guy coming to God. And he's still not a Christian yet, but he's now back to God. He's come to God. And so he talked about it, and he eventually, as he gets to his second term, I guess it was really about the time of Gettysburg, he told an Illinois clergyman when he finally became a Christian. This is what he told the clergyman. He said, when I left Springfield, he said, I asked the people to pray for me. Now, he's from Springfield, Illinois. And so when he got on the back of that train to go to Washington, D.C., he's been elected president. He's now going to the inauguration. He said, when I got on the back of that train in Springfield, I asked the people to pray for me. He said, but at that time, he says, I was not a Christian. He said, when I buried my son, the severest trial of my life, and this was not Eddie, this was actually Willie. It was one of the other sons that died, and again, the sons died young. He said, when I buried my son, the severest trial of my life, I was not a Christian. He said, but when I went to Gettysburg, he said, when I was at Gettysburg, and I saw there the graves of thousands of our soldiers, and there were actually 51,000 casualties at Gettysburg. He said, when I'm there, and I'm seeing all the death and all of our soldiers that have been killed, he said, I then and there consecrated myself to Christ. Yes, I do love Jesus. So that's what he told the Illinois clergyman as to the time of when he came to faith as a Christian. He's come back to God. Now he's become a Christian. And it's interesting. I think that is an accurate statement because what happened shortly after that at Gettysburg was the second inaugural address. Now, the second inaugural address, and you see Lincoln there at his second inaugural. And by the way, this is the only photograph that has Abraham Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth in the same photograph. I can't show you now, I'm not where I can point to it, but up on that upper balcony above Lincoln is John Wilkes Booth. And John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Lincoln, actually tried to assassinate him here. It failed, and those who saw it happen didn't understand what it was, and so they kind of facilitated it, but the crowd came between Lincoln and Booth, and so he wasn't killed at that time. But nonetheless, this is second inaugural. If you go to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., inside the Lincoln Memorial, engraved in stone, are two great speeches of Lincoln. One is the Gettysburg Address, the other is his second inaugural address. It's probably one of the very shortest inaugural addresses that's ever happened in American history. And it's at a time of spiritual conflict, and he talks about it. Both sides are fighting, both sides believe in God, both sides claim to be Christian, and he kind of analyzed the conflict from a spiritual perspective. And you read this second inaugural, you go, that is deep. That's really rich. It's pretty obvious it's something that's happened to Lincoln in that period of time. So going back to Lincoln, it's interesting that Lincoln recognized that we've got to have God's help, sure, but more important than that, we need to be right with God. So he issued a call for a day of proclamation, and it's a proclamation, you can see here, for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. And it's interesting, when you read the text of the proclamation, it really doesn't say much about the Civil War. You really don't know that a Civil War is going on. He's just talking about every one of us needs to get right with God. We all need to look in the mirror and say, where are we with God? Are we doing what God wants? And it's just a call for every one of us to connect with God and do the right thing. And it's interesting to see what happened after this proclamation for humiliation, fasting, and prayer. Glenn Beck is a good friend of mine. I actually help run Glenn's nonprofits. I'm chairman of the board for Glenn. And he and I done a lot of TV together. I want to show you one of the programs that he and I did a little while back.
Okay, talking about Abraham Lincoln, the change in him, Gettysburg. He really, he says, now I am a Christian, now I get it. And I don't know how many of us can really say that. I mean, we can all say we're a Christian, or we can all say, oh, I believe in God. But how many of us can say, no. After all these tragedies, I still didn't get it. Now I get it. And he calls people to fast and pray and says, this is it, right? What happens?
I'll show you. This is a timeline of the major battles of the Civil War. Now, there's a lot of other minor battles. You got Pea Ridge, you got Stones River, you got all these other battles. But let me show you, as the Civil War progresses, how the Union was doing. The Union won Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. They won Shiloh, and that's it. Everything else belongs to the Confederacy. Then they get over here. They win Gettysburg. They win.
Wait. Where does the thing happen? Where does the?
Come back to that.
Okay.
Vicksburg. They win Chattanooga. They lose Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. They win Petersburg, Richmond. They win on Sherman's March. They win Atlanta. They win Mobile Bay. They win Nashville. They win Appomattox, and that's the end of the Civil War. Now, pretty clear difference. That's where he had the National Day of Fasting and Prayer, right there. That's before, that's after.
So then after that, shortly after that, the South concedes. They signed the surrender document. The Civil War is over. And so Lincoln, his entire presidency has been in a war. It started when he got there. It's come to the end of the war. And so he says, let's relax a little bit. So he goes to the theater. And when he gets to the theater, he is killed by John Wilkes Booth, the assassination. And it's interesting to see what happened the day of the assassination. The day of the assassination, he and Mary Todd got in a carriage and went for a ride around D.C. And they were just talking about, this is so different. This is the first time in 2 terms that we haven't been at war. It's the first time I haven't had to think about what we're going to do in the war and what the generals need to do and what I need to send them. We finally have a time of, what are we going to do? And so they talked about what they do, and he said, why don't we just get away from D.C. for a while, and let's just take some time off and go and just renew our and so this is what they decided to do. This is what Abe said to Mary Todd. He said, we'll visit the Holy Land. We'll see those places hallowed by the footsteps of the Savior. There's no city on earth I so much desire to see as Jerusalem. And that night he's killed. And so he never got to fulfill his final wish. Every bit of his presidency was a war from top to bottom all the way through. And he never, and this is, by the way, what he would have seen in Jerusalem at that time in 1865. But the turning point was here. And as Charles Coffin earlier said, there were other forces silent at work, a divine hand directing the counterplan. So if you don't understand that, you miss the story. And most of us never have the spiritual side of the story of what happened there, or what happened with Lincoln, or what happened in the National Day of Prayer. We get a fairly secular view of it. So we all studied Abraham Lincoln in school. We just didn't study what God was up to with Abraham Lincoln or anybody else at that point in time. I'm going to take you into the 19th century now, or leaving the 19th century, 1800s. I want to take you into the 20th century. And I want to pick up with some things in World War II that some of you may know about from your parents or grandparents. You've certainly read about it in school. But there's some things that you didn't get in school that I want to show you how significant they are. Starting World War II, Pearl Harbor starts it off. So the attack on Pearl Harbor, December the 7th, 1941, starts what goes with Pearl Harbor. And as a result, America declares war on Japan. Japan never declared war on us. They declared war back home, but they never told us they declared war. So we declare war on Japan. As a result of us declaring war on Japan, Hitler and Mussolini have a pact with Tojo that if any one of us have war declared, the others will come to the aid. So as a result of us declaring war on Japan, both Mussolini and Hitler declare war on the United States. We weren't fighting and they didn't attack us, we weren't doing them, but now they're going to attack us. So as a result, we respond and say, okay, we're gonna go to war against Hitler and against Mussolini. So in a process of 3 days, you have 6 declarations, 4 days, you have 6 declarations of war. You have those 3 Axis nations and our 3 declarations against Axis nations. America now finds itself in war. State of the Union address happened just a few weeks after all this was going. We didn't see any of this coming at all. And so in the State of the Union address by FDR in January of 42, remember Pearl Harbor was December the 7th, I want you to listen to what FDR tells the nation and the world about what this war is and what it's all about.
The world is too small to provide adequate living room for both Hitler and God. In proof of that, the Nazis have now announced their plan for enforcing their new German pagan religion all over the world, the plan by which the Holy Bible and the cross of mercy would be displaced by Mein Kampf and the swastika and the naked sword.
Yeah, did you get that? The Bible, cross of mercy, Mein Kampf, swastika, naked sword. They're after the Bible. It's interesting to see what the U.S. government printing office did. U.S. government printing office, after that speech by President Roosevelt, and we're told he's a liberal progressive Democrat, after that speech, this is the poster we use to raise money for the war. Notice this, this is the enemy. Anything that attacks the Bible is the enemy in America. What do you think would happen today if we came out with a poster like that? They would lose their mind. Oh, a bunch of Christian nationalists. No, he's a liberal progressive Democrat. There's no way he's a Christian nationalist, and yet we understood the spiritual conflict that was at the basis of World War II, and he tells the whole Congress and the whole world about it. And by the way, look at some of the other posters we came out with back then. Look at all the people praying. Look at this one, the nativity scene. Look at this one, strong in the strength of the Lord. This one, out of the Lord's Prayer, deliver us from evil, Matthew 6:13. These are the war bonds we turned out in World War II, and they have this really strong biblical theme throughout. This is what we understood as a nation, Democrats and Republicans both. This is what we had back then. Now, obviously, as a result of what happened at Pearl Harbor, we've gone to war, and so Americans rallied, the recruiting offices, just the lines were so stinking long, you couldn't hardly get in. And when you became a recruit and you went, say, into the Army, one of the things you got was you were given this Bible. This Bible, you see, signed by Franklin Roosevelt there at the bottom. It has a message saying, hey, soldier, you're now in a war. You need to understand that if you don't do a lot of praying and reading the Bible, you're not going to be able to survive this the way you need to. So you got the president. This goes to every soldier in the Army. You get a Bible with the president saying you got to spend time in God's Word. Now, if you were in the Navy, you got a different one. The Army, it had a brown cover on the outside, Army. The Navy Bible had a blue cover on the outside. Navy, makes sense, ocean. Except they had a Christian flag flying higher than the American flag. Now that would trigger people today. You can't put any flag higher than the American flag. Yes, you can. Today in the U.S. flag code, the only flag that is allowed to fly higher than the U.S. flag is the flag calling you to divine service. Even in our flag code, we put God above country, even in the flag code today. Matter of fact, here's one of those battleships from World War II, and you see the Christian flag flying higher. Twice a day, that flag went above the American flag, calling sailors to come pray. Time of divine service on board the ships. So we still have a big problem with what's happened. We're now under attack. We have now declared war. But the problem we have, it goes back to World War I. After we helped win World War I, as you've heard from President Woodrow Wilson, this is the war to end all wars. We don't ever want to get into another world war again, and the best way to do that is to make sure we're not a threat to anybody. If we're not a threat to anybody, they want to attack us because we're not a threat to them. And so we demilitarized virtually everything. When World War II broke out, the training for how to use a machine gun was they took broomsticks and painted them black. And you used wooden sticks to point where you would like a machine gun. The training for a bazooka was they took pipes and painted them black and showed you how to put them on. We didn't even have the equipment. As a matter of fact, when World War II began, we were still flying biplanes out of World War I. Now, the Germans already had jets, and we're still flying biplanes. And our tanks, we had tanks from World War I, but the Germans, they have these Panzers and these Tigers, and better than anything we have. So we have to gear up. And man, did America do a fantastic job of mobilizing for the war. We started turning out Sherman tanks like crazy. Now, understand, this is okay, but the Sherman tank was not very good compared to anything the Germans had. Out of the top 12 tanks in World War II, the Sherman was number 8. There were 7 tanks that were better than our Shermans, but at least we had something that wasn't World War I. But then we started turning out planes like these B-24 Liberators. We turned out a B-24 every 55 minutes off the assembly line, if you can imagine that. One plane every 55, and it takes us 3.5 years to get a stupid healthcare website up. But nonetheless, we can turn out planes. And we turned out a Liberty ship out of the docks every 4 days. I mean, it's unbelievable what we did. So we finally go to war in Europe in November of 42. Now remember, we got hit in December of 41. We're talking 11 months later before we have created enough military might to be able to go to war. So we attack German holdings over in North Africa and the Mediterranean. We go, it's called Operation Torch. There were 3 task force that landed in November of 1942, and that one on the left is called the Western Task Force. That was led by a young guy named Patton. He wasn't famous yet at all, but he's the guy leading that task force. And Patton has his own philosophy of war and how to conduct it. And so all the troops are going ashore, and of all those 3 task force that landed, Patton's is the only one that's successful. And his guys are able to pull off all sorts of really good stuff in a matter of days. They've subdued the Germans there and all the Italian forces that are there. And so the other task force are bogged down. They're fighting Rommel, the great tank general for Germany. And Rommel is the wizard of tanks at that point in time, and they're just mopping the floor, mopping the Allies, the British, the Americans. And that's when they tell Patton, hey, you go over and take over the tank stuff and see if you can win these. So Patton does. He moves his tanks in and he whips Rommel and whips him really good. And this is what starts establishing Patton as a great general. And so they move across North Africa. They take all of North Africa. They then move over to Sicily, take Sicily back from the Nazis. Then they move up through Italy, and they're getting close toward coming into Germany. And this is about the time that D-Day occurs. And so D-Day, at this point in time, there's no question our best general is Patton. And so what happens is Eisenhower and others, they take Patton and said, look, you're going to be in charge of what's called Operation Fortitude. Operation Fortitude, they took Patton out of Italy and they moved him over to England and put him there in Dover and said, we're going to let you lead all the forces that attacked the Germans. We're crossing the channel over to Calais. If you can see on the map there, Dover, England, and Calais, France, or Belgium, you see over there, but Calais, France, that's the closest area. That's only 23 miles apart. So we can easily get our ships over there and we'll attack. And Germans know it's coming. The Germans put millions of troops along the coast there of the Mediterranean, knowing that they're going to be attacked. And knowing that Patton is the great leader, they double the forces over at Calais because that's where Patton's coming. And so they're flying their reconnaissance missions, and the German planes are flying over England and seeing all the buildup of forces. And you look down at a farm, and all of a sudden it's got all these tanks out there, man. Every farm is a muster point for all these Allied tanks, and the Germans are just, man, this is going to be a big one. And what they're seeing was all a lie. Those tanks, this is the tanks they were seeing. They were inflatables. We blew them up and moved them around every night. And so every farm had all these tanks. And so as the German reconnaissance planes go over, they're seeing all the stuff and it's all fake. So we're assembling these tanks and reassemble. Same with all of the airplanes. They saw fields and fields and squadrons of planes, and they were all fake. I mean, from the air, that looks like a plane on the ground. But when you're on the ground, there's nothing to it. So this is what's happening with D-Day, and they're getting ready for all this. And so it now comes time for Patton to attack, except he had absolutely nothing to do with this except be a decoy. The real place was Normandy, and Normandy is where we attacked several hundred miles away. But because Patton was so significant, the Germans moved half of their troops over to meet Patton. Now, we still had thousands of casualties on D-Day, but a whole lot less than what it would have been if they had left all the troops there. Having moved over to stop Patton, who was he was a decoy, he was a fake, he was holding press conferences all the time saying, here's what we're going to do to the Germans when we cross. He had nothing to do with any of that. He's just the decoy over there. So when D-Day occurs, it's a top secret operation. Nobody knows it's happening. And President Roosevelt, now he's fully briefed on all the stuff that happens on D-Day and all the troops that are going in, 26,000 paratroops, going to all the stuff that happened on D-Day he's aware of, but the American people are not aware of it. It's been top secret. So when the invasion starts, he goes on radio in one of his fireside chats. He was famous for just talking to the people bluntly. Here's what's going on. Here's what you need to know. And he did a fireside chat to say, hey guys, we've been talking about Italy in the last couple of days, but while I was talking to you about Italy, there was actually another operation getting ready to go, and that operation has now started, and it's D-Day. I want you to hear how he announced, this is his announcement on his fireside chat. This is how he tells the people what's going on.
And so, in this poignant hour, I ask you to join with me in prayer. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness in their faith. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard.
He goes on praying for 6.5 minutes. So that's how America found out about D-Day, was the president led a 6.5 minute. What do you think would happen if Trump led a prayer today out of the White House that lasted 6.5 minutes, announcing an invasion of wherever, whether it was the invasion of Iran or Venezuela or anything? They'd lose their minds. And again, this is a liberal progressive Democrat doing this, but we didn't get taught this in school. We didn't know this. That's why it seems so unusual today, because we don't know how common this was for all people back then. This was just an American thing. So after D-Day, and by the way, the Christmas card for the White House in Christmas of 1944 was they took the D-Day prayer and made it the Christmas card for the White House. So that's the D-Day prayer. It's 6.5 minutes long. That's one of the originals that we have that you can see if you come to the museum. But as a result of D-Day, and we start breaking through the German lines, start moving into Germany, start moving into mainland Europe, that results in the Battle of the Bulge. Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest battle in World War II for the Americans. And what happened was, after we landed at Normandy, the deal is, all right, we're going to take all those troops and we're going to chase the Germans out of France and back into Germany. So they built a 1,200-mile line along the German-French border. This is when they brought Patton back in. Once we get all the troops in, they bring Patton back over, they put him in Europe, say, now take the army and go do this. And so there's two generals. The northern part of that line that you see up there is by Courtney Hodges, the First Army. The lower part of that 1,200-mile square is Patton. Patton's got the Third Army. And so they're going to push all the Germans out of France and back into Germany. Then we're going to defeat the Germans, and that's going to be the end of the war. The Germans realize that if we get shoved back into Germany, we're done. We don't have a hope of winning. For us to win, we've got to break through. And so what they did was they planned a counterattack right up there in that red box. That was in the highest part of the Alps in that part of the country, and it's where no one thought they could possibly attack. Courtney Hodges actually put his fatigued men up there, the guys that were just battle-worn and couldn't do anything, put them up there for rest and recuperation. And then here came the Germans with 1,800 tanks and with 200,000 men, and they hit up in the high mountains, and they went through Courtney Hodges' line like there was no line there. They went 80 miles behind the Americans, then they turned around and started attacking from behind. So the American line is now being attacked front and back. That's called Blitzkrieg. That's what the Germans did. They would break through and attack you from both sides at the same time. So the whole movement has now stopped. And Eisenhower tells Patton, he said, Patton, you got to go up there and save Hodges, get all your troops up there. Patton was already ready to do that. But this now this is November and December of 1944. And this is really bad weather time in Europe, traditionally bad weather, the snow, the rains, everything else. And the problem we had, our tanks weren't that good. And so the way we defeated the Germans was we put our fighter planes in the air, P-47s, P-51s, and our fighter planes would take out the German tanks because our tanks couldn't take out the German tanks. Our tanks were good at taking out German mortars and German machine guns and German infantry, but we had to have something to take out their tanks, and that was our fighters. Well, Patton has now gone through 6 consecutive weeks of not being able to get a plane in the air because it's been cloudy and raining and snowing for 6 straight weeks. And so what he does is he calls in his chief of chaplains for the Third Army, James O'Neill. And he says, Chaplain, you got a prayer for weather? And O'Neill said, I don't know, sir. Let me check the prayer books and see what I got. And so O'Neill said that Patton, at that point, put his hands behind his back, turned his back on him, walked over to the window, stood at the window looking out at all the rain that was going outside, all the bad weather, and he said, Chaplain, do our soldiers pray? And O'Neill said, oh, well, yes, sir. That's why we have chaplain. He said, I didn't ask if the chaplains prayed. I asked if the soldiers prayed. He said, well, there's no atheist in Fox. No, I want to know if we've got 250,000 soldiers in the Army. I want to know, are they praying right now for the weather to change? And O'Neill said, no, but we'll get them doing that. And so what happened was O'Neill wrote this card. This is a prayer card. You see on the left side there, it has Christmas holly. This is how we spent Christmas of 1944, was in the Battle of the Bulge. And this is a prayer card, and you see here on this side, it's signed by George Patton, and it's wishing all the soldiers in the Third Army a Merry Christmas, right in the middle of this worst battle in World War II. Here's the prayer that was prayed. He had 250,000 soldiers getting ready to pray this. They printed it in the Third Army. It says, Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee of Thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee, that armed with thy power, we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish thy justice among men and nations. Amen. So this is the prayer card that was made. Now, they had not distributed it yet. They're moving, and by the way, in case you didn't know, Patton, as tough and rough as he was actually a church-going Sunday school teacher. He taught kids in Sunday school. And so nobody knows that about Patton. Now, I mean, that's not part. Well, as he's going to set up his Third Army to be able to help Hodges out in the First Army in the Battle of the Bulge, they get into Luxembourg. And by the way, there was an interesting tradition that Patton had as he's marching through France and pushing the Germans out. The religion in Europe then was largely high church, a lot of Catholic, a lot of Anglican. And high church means that there's a lot of eye candy with it, a lot of the grandeur of God. You go in those little chapels and there's going to be statues of Jesus and statues of the apostles and statues of the saints. It's all meant to invoke the majesty of God. And so what would happen as Patton was pushing the army and pushing the Germans back, as he would go through each town, he would stop and go into the church with his officers. And he would go into the church, he would walk up to the statue of Jesus, he'd pull his helmet off and put it under his arm and said, "Sir, I have a report to give you." And he would tell Jesus what had happened in the last few days. We beat the Germans over here, we chased them out of this town. Now next week I'm gonna be over here and I need your help when I get there. And so he would just brief him like he was briefing Eisenhower. And so he's telling Jesus all the stuff that's going on. So when he got to Luxembourg, which is where he set up headquarters for Battle of the Bulge, he did the same thing. He went into the church to have a conversation with Jesus. The title of this, after he did this is what made the papers, General Patton's Prayer to Turn the Battle of the Bulge Tide Revealed. His officers were so struck by what Patton said to Jesus that they wrote it all down, and there was actually a painting done of it. So this is Patton talking to Jesus, and Patton is really ticked at this point because we've gone through 6 weeks of bad weather. He can't get planes in the air. We should have won this, and we're losing American lives, and he doesn't like that. And so this is what he tells Jesus. He said, "Sir, I can't help but feel that I've offended you in some way, that suddenly you've lost all sympathy with our cause, that you're throwing in with von Rundstedt," he's the guy over the tanks, "you're throwing in von Rundstedt and his paper-hanging God." That means Hitler. Hitler was a paper hanger before the war. So he called him the paper-hanging God. He says, "You know without me telling you that our situation is desperate. Sure, I can tell my staff that everything is going according to plan, but there's no use telling you that my 101st Airborne is holding out against tremendous odds in Bastogne. Without your cooperation from a weather standpoint, I'm deprived of an accurate disposition of the Germans, and how can I be intelligent in my attack? All this probably sounds unreasonable to you, but I've lost all patience with your chaplains who insist that this is a typical Ardennes winter, and I must have faith." The chaplain said, "Look, sir, this happens every year. This is a typical year. It'll change in a few weeks." He said, "I've had it. I keep asking these guys to pray the weather will change." He said, "You just got to make up your mind whose side you're on." He said, "You must come to my assistance so that I may dispatch the entire German army as a birthday present to your Prince of Peace." He closed out, he said, "If you'll give me 4 days of good weather, I'll send you so many Germans, your bookkeepers in heaven won't be able to keep up with all the Germans I send." So that's Patton in that prayer that he did. Now, as it turns out, right at that time is when they distributed the prayer cards. So he's had this conversation with Jesus. He's asked for 4 days of good weather. The prayer cards go out. 250,000 guys are now praying about a weather change and answered prayer. We have the after-action report of the Third Army, and for 6 straight days they had perfect weather. And it's interesting, the weather reporters, the meteorologists say, it's miraculous. The weather's suddenly cleared and it's a clear sky. And they can't figure out why, because that's not what the meteorological stuff shows. They get the planes back in the air, they pound the Germans, that changes the tide, we win the Battle of the Bulge. As Patton is leaving town to go back and resume the southern part of the trek, pushing the Germans back into France, he stops by the church, and he actually goes up to Jesus again, and he apologizes. "I'm sorry I got mad at you." And he just has this conversation with Jesus. He said, "Thank you for answering the prayers. I'm sorry I got mad." So it's just Patton. Did you get that in school? Anybody hear these stories? They're so well documented, they're so fun, and they make history so fun. History's not fun when you take the story away from it, and we don't teach the story anymore. So Patton goes on, he leads the forces into Germany, pushes Hitler back. Hitler commits suicide. Hitler commits suicide. The Japanese say, okay, that's it for us. We drop the atomic bomb, they're out. Japan quits the war, and so we finally reach peace at that point. It's interesting that a proclamation for a day of Thanksgiving was given by President Truman at that time. It's a proclamation we own signed by President Truman at the bottom, and it's a big thank you God proclamation. It's not squishy in any way, shape, fashion, or form. One other story I'll tell you before we close out. Dwight Eisenhower, of course you know, was the commander-in-chief European forces in World War II. What you may not know is what happened to Eisenhower when he was 13 years old. Here's his family. This is Dwight, you see on the left side. You see this picture there is 1902. He was born in 1890 in Denison, Texas. He grew up in Kansas. And this is 1902 family photograph. There's, you see the 6 boys there, and then his mom, dad, and his mother, his dad and his mother are there. And so what happens, the next year, something happened that involved Dwight and his older brother, Edgar. You see Edgar there. Now, remember, Eisenhower, commander-in-chief, without him, things would not have turned out right at all. But what happened is, in this incident that happened, Dwight was coming home from school. He fell coming home from school and he skinned his knee. And he got home, and it was a Friday afternoon when he did that. He got home. They were part of the River Brethren Church denomination. They're going to church on Sunday. It was church all day long on Sunday. And Sunday came, and Dwight said, oh, my leg, it hurts so bad. And so they looked at it and had some swelling. Okay, you can stay home today. We'll check you when we get back from church tonight, because they went to church all day long. So they got back that night, and when they looked at Dwight's leg, his leg was so swollen that they actually had to cut his pants and cut his shoe to be able to look at it. It just ballooned out. And man, it's got dark streaks coming up his leg, and it's really bad. And so they called the family doctor, Doc Conklin, and Doc Conklin, remember this is 1903, Doc Conklin comes in a horse and buggy. He gets there, they got Dwight upstairs in a bedroom. Dwight's got a high fever, he's delirious, he's going in and out of consciousness. And Doc Conklin goes in to look at him, and Conklin comes out and he says, this is really bad. And so he's talking to the mother, Ida, and his father, and he said, this is really bad. He said, I think I can save his life, but I'm gonna have to take his leg off to do it. He's a young boy, he's got a lot of strength, he can fight back with that, but if I can get the infection gone, I think we can save his life. No antibiotics at that time. Antibiotics were first used at D-Day. That's the first time we used antibiotics, was at D-Day. So he doesn't have antibiotics, and it just happened that Dwight was conscious at that time and heard the conversation going on. So they said, look, save his life, do what you gotta do. So Conklin gets back in his horse and buggy, he goes back to his office to get literally the saw that he's going to use to saw off the leg. And he's coming back, and so in the meantime, Dwight calls his brother Edgar and says, Edgar, come here. And so Edgar gets in and says, Edgar, you swear to me that you won't let them take my leg off. You can imagine a conversation. Dwight, we got to save your life, bro. I mean, we got. No, you swear you won't. And so it goes back and forth, and finally Edgar swears that he will not let Doc Conklin take his leg off. So when Doc Conklin comes back, he goes upstairs, and Edgar's blocking the door. And Doc says, hey, Edgar, I need to go in and treat your brother. I'm sorry, Doc, can't let you go in. Edgar, I need to get in and treat your brother. It's really serious. I'm sorry, Doc, you can't go in. Edgar, I need to get in. If I don't treat your brother, he's gonna die, and you're gonna be responsible for it. I'm sorry, Doc, you can't go in. Conklin, really angry, turns around, goes down the stairs. As he's going out the door, he slams the door. Last thing he says, the only thing that'll save that boy's life is a miracle. And Ida and Dad heard that and said, yeah. And so they all started praying very seriously. They'd been kind of praying up to then, but you got medical doctors, and so they started praying real seriously. And then 2 days later, Dwight, instead of being dead, the discoloration's going out, the swelling's going down, things are changing. They keep the prayer going, and within a week, Dwight's back to himself. 2 weeks, he's got all of his strength back, and so he doesn't lose his leg. Now, question is, not a question, the comment is, If Dwight loses his leg, is he commander-in-chief in World War II? No. There is no way in the world. And Dwight was a key reason for winning World War II in Europe. Matter of fact, Churchill pushed for Dwight, an American general, over his own British generals because Dwight thought outside the box. He had a whole different way of looking at things. And that's what made all the key. Dwight went from being a colonel to being a 5-star general in that war. That's how significant he was in that. And then he becomes president of the United States. And it's interesting, when he was president, he went to communion that morning before he was sworn in. And he writes, he says, I really felt like America was becoming too secular. And I thought, what can I do? He said, I'm not a preacher, I can't preach a sermon. And after communion, he felt like there was something he could do. And so what he did was, when he was inaugurated in 1953, right after he's sworn in on the program, you look at the program, he's swearing in the inaugural address. But he started his inaugural address in a very unusual way. I'm going to show you YouTube again so you can see what he did. He's now just been sworn in.
My friends, before I begin the expression of those thoughts that I deem appropriate to this moment, would you permit me the privilege of uttering a little private prayer of my own? And I ask that you bow your heads. Almighty God, as we stand here at this moment, my future associates in the executive branch of government, join me in beseeching that thou wilt make full and complete our dedication to the service of the people in this throng and their fellow citizens everywhere. Give us, we pray, the power to discern clearly right from wrong, and allow all our words and actions to be governed thereby and by the laws of this land. Especially we pray that our concern shall be for all the people, regardless of station, race, or calling. May cooperation be permitted and be the mutual aim of those who, under the concepts of our Constitution, hold to differing political faiths, so that all may work for the good of our beloved country and thy glory. Amen.
So he prays his own inaugural prayer. Now, we actually own that prayer. This is the handwritten prayer that he wrote out that morning to pray. And so that's what he prayed, but his concern was America was becoming too secular. He served 2 terms as president. It's interesting to see what he did. In those 2 terms, he started the National Prayer Breakfast, first Thursday of every February. Around 8,000 gathered in Washington, D.C., including from about leaders from 140 different global nations gather in D.C. It's interesting, the prayer they pray every year is the one that George Washington had in his 1783 resignation letter when he left the military himself. And so that's the prayer that's used every year. But he also attended church at New York Presbyterian Church, and the Reverend George Dockery was the pastor there. And in 1954, Reverend Dockery preached this sermon. A text is Galatians, you see it there, Galatians 3:28. And Dockery was an immigrant from Scotland, and he's over here pastoring that church. And he said, I asked my kids this week, what do you do at school, in American schools? And they said, oh, regular stuff. He said, well, I don't know what regular stuff is. What do you do in school? Well, we open with prayer and we say the Pledge of Allegiance, and you say, what? The Pledge of Allegiance, what's that? And he didn't know what the pledge was, and they told him. And he said, I've been thinking all week about that Pledge of Allegiance. And it talks about being one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. He said, you know what? He said, the Soviets claim that. They claim to be one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The Chinese communists claim that, one nation with liberty and justice for all. He said, America's not like the other nations. He said, you guys in America really ought to put under God in your Pledge of Allegiance. And this is his sermon where he advocated that. And sitting on the front row was Eisenhower. Guess what got introduced Monday morning? A bill to put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Great idea. So we added under God the pledge in 1954, added the prayer chapel in the U.S. Congress in 1954 as well, a place to go and pray. We added, and by the way, this is a picture of Washington kneeling prayer, the way officers often reported him doing so. Psalm 16:1 is the verse around him. He also added, in God we trust, to all of our currency. It had been on 2-cent pieces under Lincoln, but now it's on every piece of currency. He made national motto, in God we trust. He did all this stuff because America was too secular. And you know what? He wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for a miracle that God performed way back when he was 13 years old, part of the story nobody ever hears about. He would not have been in the war. He would not have been our president. And by the way, he's the only president of the United States to be baptized while in office. He made a public profession of Christ while he was president, was baptized as president of the United States while in office. We've never seen that before. Never even heard of that. So that's 20th century. There's a lot of other stories I give you, but I'm going to wrap up where we started. This is Charles Coffin. Charles Coffin. He said, notice while oppressors have carried out their plans in history, there were other forces silently at work which in time undermined their plans as if a divine hand were directing the counter plan. Whoever peruses a story of liberty without recognizing this feature will fail of fully comprehending the meaning of history. Look how much history we've missed out on in years because people decided we didn't need to know this type of stuff. And there's so much awesome stuff out there. This would be the most interesting course in school if we still taught it the way it actually happened instead of the way it's been kind of sterilized over the years. He said there must be a meaning to history or else it's an incomprehensible enigma. So those are just some of the few miracles that happened in history. Kind of reads like the Bible when you go back through it. To read the story of Moses and not see any miracles, to read the story of Jesus, not see any miracles, be pretty boring. But when you see all the other stuff, it becomes alive. So that's what's called providential history. Again, if this stuff is new to you, on our table, we got all sorts of information. You can go online, Amazon, lots of stuff at WallBuilders.com as well. Mike, back to you, bro.